6 weeks after my father's funeral, I learned his second wife had forged his signature to seize 60% control of his company and siphon more than $300,000 from it, while dementia was taking him apart. My name is Vivian Marsh, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The bank teller slid the signature card toward me with the careful expression of someone who had already noticed something was wrong, but did not want to be the one to say it first. She kept her voice polite, almost gentle, as if she were offering me a seat instead of a question. "We just need you to confirm this matches your father's usual signature for the estate transfer paperwork," she said. I looked down at the card and felt the floor inside me give way. At first glance, the signature seemed close enough to fool anyone who only wanted to be fooled. The letters were in the right places. The overall shape was familiar. But my father crossed his sevens with a tiny horizontal line, a habit he had picked up in a drafting class in the 70s and never abandoned. The 7 on this page was bare, uncrossed, careless. My father had been many things in his life, but careless with his own name was never one of them. I am 36 years old. I teach high school chemistry in Minneapolis, and for most of my adult life, I believed my father, Walter Marsh, had built his little real estate company the hard way and then protected it the same way, with discipline, patience, and a stubborn refusal to cut corners. He had started with nothing glamorous. Before there were office buildings and strip malls and a company name on legal documents, there had only been a man working nights at a paper mill, putting money aside for years and telling himself he would not stay trapped in the same life forever. He bought one parcel, then another, each one a small victory over the years that had tried to keep him in place. Marsh Property Group never became one of the giant firms with glossy downtown offices and brokers in tailored suits. It stayed small enough that my brother, Desmond, and I could name every property by heart. There was the Cedar Ridge strip mall with the pharmacy and the laundromat and the sandwich place that somehow survived every recession. There was the office building near the county line where a dentist, a tax preparer, and 2 insurance companies rented space. There was the older commercial lot out west that always needed a new roof, some kind of plumbing repair, or an argument with a contractor who promised more than he delivered. It was not a huge empire, but it was ours, and more importantly, it was my father's life translated into brick, rent checks, and long-term planning. My mother died when I was 24. It was a sudden cancer diagnosis followed by a brutal year, and then she was gone before any of us had time to understand what losing her would mean. My father did what a lot of widowers do. He turned himself into a machine of work and routine. He kept the business moving. He cooked badly but reliably. He called me every Sunday. He forgot to mention that he was lonely, but everyone around him knew it anyway. 4 years after my mother died, he remarried. Her name was Renata Voss. She was a real estate agent, 19 years younger than my father, polished in a way that made every room seem to straighten itself when she entered. They met at a closing. My father liked to say she had the most organized folder of any agent he had ever worked with, which he said like it was the highest possible compliment. She laughed easily, remembered names, brought cinnamon bread to family events, and never made my father feel embarrassed about being older. When he told Desmond and me he was seeing someone, I was surprised, then relieved, and then cautiously happy for him. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to rewrite history and act like I hated her from the beginning. I did not. For the first several years of their marriage, she seemed genuinely good for him. My father had a warmth around him that had been missing after my mother died. He began inviting people over again. He wore nicer shirts. He stopped spending entire weekends alone with property spreadsheets and reruns of old movies. Renata came to my son Milo's birthday parties. She learned that Desmond was allergic to shellfish and made sure a restaurant never put shrimp near his plate. She remembered my grading deadlines and asked about my students by name. She seemed attentive in a way that, at the time, I mistook for kindness rather than precision. The first hint that something was wrong came after my father began forgetting small things. At first, it was innocent enough. He would call and ask me the same question twice in 1 week. He misplaced his keys. He left a burner on once. Then he repeated an entire story about a contractor failing to show up, not because he was trying to be funny, but because he did not realize he had already told it. He was embarrassed by these lapses, but he laughed them off. We all did, because what else do you do when the person you love starts slipping at the edges? Then the doctor used the phrase vascular dementia. It was not dramatic in the way television makes diagnoses dramatic. There was no single moment when the world shattered. Instead, there were appointments, scans, referral letters, and a kind neurologist who kept using the word progressive. There were pamphlets with thin smiles on the covers. There were family conversations conducted in hushed voices at kitchen tables. There was the awful practical realization that my father, who had once handled six figures and property negotiations without breaking a sweat, was now forgetting why he had entered a room. Renata became his main caregiver almost overnight, or at least that was how it felt from a distance. She was the one living with him. She managed the calendar. She sat through medical appointments. She answered the phone when banks, vendors, and tenants called. She said she had things under control. And because I lived in Minneapolis and Desmond had moved to Denver, we let her say that. We trusted her because there was no one else physically there every day. We called, we visited, we helped where we could, but she was the one in the house, and my father seemed calmer when she handled things, or maybe just less aware of how much was being handled around him. By the time he died, 2 years after the dementia diagnosis, he was still having lucid stretches, but they were shorter and more fragile. Some days he was almost entirely himself. He would ask Milo about school, complain about the weather, and insist on paying for takeout even when we told him not to. Other days he drifted through conversations like he was underwater, present enough to nod, but not enough to hold on to details. I was always watching for the old man I knew to come back into focus. He died in March of last year from a stroke, at home, with Renata there. The funeral was small and restrained, exactly the sort of service he would have preferred. He never liked being the center of attention. We had a Lutheran pastor read a short eulogy. The room smelled like lilies and wet coats. People spoke in low, careful voices. Renata wore black and stood near the front, pale and composed, with a handkerchief folded in one hand. She cried in the right places. I remember looking at her across the casket and feeling grateful that she seemed so heartbroken, because I thought it meant she had loved him well. I was wrong. 6 weeks later, I sat in the downtown office of Whitfield and Associates with my brother and the estate attorney, Marcus Okonkwo, to begin settling everything. Marcus was calm in the way only experienced probate lawyers seem to be calm. He had a habit of pausing before he answered, as if he wanted every sentence to be one he could stand behind later. He went through the expected things first. The will, the beneficiary designations, the basic asset list, the trust documents. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that Marsh Property Group's ownership structure had been reworked twice before my father's death. I remember the exact second my body understood what he had said. He said the transfers had moved a majority stake in the LLC from my father's sole ownership into a structure that gave Renata 60% control, with the remainder set to pass through the estate. He said it as if he were describing a routine restructuring, which in fairness was probably how it looked on paper. But my father had never told either of us about giving up control of the company. Not once. I asked Marcus to repeat himself. He did, and I felt my stomach go cold. I did not accuse anyone in that meeting. I did not even let my face do what I wanted it to do. I asked for copies of every related document, and Marcus, to his credit, did not act offended or defensive. He just nodded and said he would prepare the file. At home that night, I laid the documents on my kitchen table alongside a shoebox of old birthday cards, holiday notes, and random pieces of paper I had saved over the years because they carried my father's handwriting. I did not know yet whether I was looking at fraud or confusion or some ugly mix of both. I only knew that something felt off. The first restructuring was dated 14 months before he died. It transferred 20% of the LLC to Renata and described the move as compensation for her ongoing administrative contributions to company operations. The second one was dated 5 months before his death and moved another 40%, pushing her to 60% ownership, this time as part of long-term succession planning for company continuity. The first signature was close enough to my father's that I could imagine defending it if I had to. His hand had started to shake by then. He was slower. The letters sagged a little. If I squinted, I could tell myself that age had altered the line quality. But the second one was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The uncrossed sevens stood out immediately. The angle of the letters was too controlled. The pressure looked off. It had the feeling of someone trying hard to imitate a person they did not know intimately enough. I stared at it for a long time. Then I called Desmond. He did not answer right away, so I left a voice message that was probably too calm for what I was feeling. When he called back, I told him the facts as plainly as I could. He was silent for a moment, then asked me to send photos of the documents. After he saw them, his first words were, "That's not Dad's hand." Desmond has always been quicker to anger than I am. I am more likely to doubt myself first. He is more likely to trust his instincts and then demand evidence later. In this case, we needed both of us. We agreed not to confront Renata immediately. That was difficult, because everything in me wanted answers right then. But if she was willing to forge a signature once, then confronting her without proof could give her a chance to destroy what remained. We needed someone who knew what to look for, and we needed that person to preserve the evidence properly. So we hired a forensic document examiner named Odalis Farrow in St. Paul. Odalis was meticulous in a way that made me feel slightly ashamed of every time I had ever rushed a lab report in my chemistry classroom. She asked for authenticated samples from the final years of my father's life, and we gave her everything we had: tax forms, medical consents, loan paperwork, greeting cards, restaurant receipts where he had jotted a tip, a birthday card he had signed 3 weeks before the second restructuring. She compared stroke direction, pressure, spacing, letter formation, and the tiny habits people rarely think about until someone imitates them badly. 3 weeks later, she called us into her office. She said the first restructuring signature was consistent with genuine writing that had degraded under age and illness. She would not go so far as to say with certainty that my father had knowingly signed it, because dementia complicates the issue of capacity, but she could not call it a forgery. Then she said the second signature was not produced by my father's hand. The word forgery hung in the air like smoke. I remember Desmond leaning back in the chair and putting both hands over his face. I remember staring at the report and seeing the cold logic of it, the way science can make a horrifying truth feel even more final because it is so exact. Odalis said the second signature was likely traced or carefully free-handed by someone working from an imitation, but not from the muscle memory of the real man. The line pressure was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. The sevens were wrong. I thought about that line for a long time after we left her office. The sevens were wrong. That should have been absurdly small, almost laughable. Instead, it felt like the smallest detail in the world had become the doorway to a crime. That night, I did not sleep. By morning, Desmond had already decided he wanted a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse and contested estates. He found one named Grover Illick, a probate litigator with a reputation for being patient, unsentimental, and very hard to bluff. We met him 2 days later in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. He listened without interrupting while we laid out the timeline. My father's diagnosis, Renata's increasing control, the ownership changes, the signature card at the bank, the report from Odalis. Grover did not react dramatically. That was what I liked about him. When we finished, he asked for the original documents, not copies, and he asked very specific questions about who had access to what and when. He wanted to know which family members had visited. He wanted names of physicians. He wanted to know whether my father had a power of attorney and who held it. He wanted every detail because in cases like this, details are what survive the screaming. He explained that we had 2 separate issues. The first restructuring might be attacked on capacity and undue influence. If my father was already cognitively impaired, and if Renata was the one benefiting from the transfer while also controlling his daily life, there was a real argument that he had not freely and knowingly approved it. The second restructuring was different. If the signature was forged, then the document was void from the start. He said it plainly. Forgery is not a misunderstanding. It is a crime. Grover filed a formal contest with probate court, freezing any further distribution of the disputed business interests. He also referred the matter to the county attorney's office. He warned us not to contact Renata directly, because once she knew the documents were being challenged, she would have every reason to build a defense or destroy anything still useful to us. That filing changed the atmosphere immediately. Before that, there was still the possibility of some painful but ordinary explanation. After that, there was no going back to ordinary. Renata's attorney responded quickly. Her version of events was that my father had wanted to provide for his wife, and had chosen to make sure the company remained in stable hands. She claimed Desmond and I were grieving adult children unable to accept that he had trusted his spouse with more responsibility than us. I read the filing twice before I could believe she had the nerve to describe us that way. I had spent years calling, visiting, helping, bringing my son over, checking on him after appointments, and now she was painting us as absent children who suddenly cared only because money was involved. That was the moment my sympathy for her died completely. The problem for Renata was that the paper trail kept widening. Grover subpoenaed bank records as part of the contested proceeding. Odalis reviewed them with the same care she had given the restructuring documents. What she found was worse than anything I had hoped for, and better than anything Renata deserved to get away with. 4 separate transfers had been made from a business investment account into a personal account in Renata's name. Together, they totaled a little over $300,000. The earliest transfer was large enough to matter, but not so large that it immediately screamed fraud. It looked like the sort of thing a spouse might authorize in an emergency. but the following 3 transfers matched the same forged signature pattern as the second restructuring. The pressure, the rhythm, the unnatural smoothness in the letters. My father's hand was not there. Only the first transfer appeared genuine, or at least genuine enough that Odalise could not say otherwise. And that is the part that bothered me the most, because it meant there had been a moment when my father may truly have trusted her with access, or perhaps simply signed something while not fully understanding what it did, and that small opening had been exploited until it became a path wide enough to steal nearly everything that mattered. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. It changes the way you grieve when you realize the person who was supposed to protect your parent was also the person taking advantage of him. It is one thing to lose someone to sickness. It is another to learn that the sickness made him easier to drain. I began replaying old memories with new suspicion. There was the Sunday afternoon when I visited 8 months before he died, and Renata told me he needed his rest. She had been so brisk about it that I remembered feeling vaguely annoyed. At the time, I chalked it up to caregiver exhaustion. Now I wondered whether she had wanted me gone because my father was more alert when I was there, and alertness was inconvenient. There was another visit when she hovered behind him while he signed a stack of insurance forms, guiding the pen toward the line with a hand on the back of his chair. I had noticed then that she was over-involved, but I had also been desperate not to become the daughter who saw conspiracy everywhere. Looking back now, I wish I had been exactly that suspicious. Desmond took the news harder than I did in some ways. He had a more explosive reaction, which meant he made a series of furious phone calls before Grover told us to stop all direct contact with Renata immediately. Desmond wanted to drive to the house, pound on the door, and demand to know how she could have done this. I understood the instinct. I had it too, but we were both forced to learn that anger does not help if you cannot pair it with evidence. So we stayed focused. Grover built the civil case carefully. Odalise prepared a formal report. He framed the issue around the forged documents, the suspicious transfers, and the undue influence that had clearly shadowed the first restructuring. He filed the expanded findings. Then he sent everything to the county attorney. Renata's side hired their own handwriting expert. That part felt almost insulting. Their examiner was competent enough to argue around the edges, but not strong enough to undermine the central conclusions. Under deposition, even he had to admit that the inconsistencies in the second restructuring and the 3 later fund transfers were difficult to explain by natural decline alone. He did not fully surrender the argument, but he could not defend it with any conviction either. And once that happened, Grover told us the case had essentially stopped being a question of whether Renata could win outright. It had become a question of how much damage she could do before the settlement arrived. The deposition itself was a strange kind of ordeal. I had imagined legal proceedings would feel dramatic, maybe even theatrical, like courtroom television where everyone knows exactly when to object, and every revelation lands like a thunderclap. Real life was duller and somehow crueler. There were fluorescent lights, bottled water, long pauses while attorneys looked through binders, questions repeated in slightly different wording until someone finally said the thing they had been avoiding. When Odalise explained the strokes in my father's signature, she did it with the patience of a teacher. She showed how a forger often imitates shape but misses rhythm. She pointed out the micropauses, the hesitations where real muscle memory would flow. She explained that people who know the original signer well notice habits the naked eye can't measure, like my father's crossed sevens, his habit of lifting the pen between the first and last names, and the way the end of his surname always dipped lower than the rest. That last detail had been with him since I was a child. Seeing it analyzed in a professional report made the room feel colder. The county attorney's office moved more slowly, but eventually the criminal case began to take shape. By then, Renata understood what we had. Her settlement posture changed noticeably. It was not an apology. It was strategy. Her lawyer proposed a negotiated resolution. The second restructuring would be voided. Some of the money would be returned. The first transfer might stand or be compromised depending on the court's view of capacity. Grover pushed back hard. He reminded them that the documentary evidence did not vanish just because Renata wanted to settle quietly. Months passed. That is the part people never mention when they talk about uncovering fraud. The discovery itself is shocking, but the aftermath is a long and dull fight, full of paperwork and waiting and carefully measured anger. Every month that passed felt like living inside a cordoned-off room where the air had gone stale. The grief was not new anymore, but it kept changing shape. During that time, I kept teaching. Standing in front of my chemistry students was strangely stabilizing. They wanted to know about reaction rates, stoichiometry, whether a lab was going to be on the test. Their lives were immediate and straightforward. Outside the classroom, my world was full of forgery, court filings, and a dead man whose trust had been weaponized. Inside the classroom, if I could get sodium and chloride to behave according to predictable rules, I could pretend the universe was still orderly. Milo was 11 then. He knew enough to sense that something awful was happening around Grandpa Walter's company, but he did not know the details. With a family therapist's guidance, I kept the explanation age-appropriate. I told him that adults sometimes make dishonest choices that hurt people, and that part of growing up is understanding that love does not excuse wrongdoing. He accepted that with the seriousness children reserve for truths they can feel but not yet fully understand. He asked me once whether Renata had been mean to Grandpa. I told him, I think she hurt him in ways he never expected. That was true, and it was also the sort of answer a child can sit with. The first real breakthrough in the case came when the deposition of Renata's own handwriting expert revealed he could not confidently explain away the signature differences. That, combined with the bank records, pushed her attorney into actual settlement discussions. No one said the word guilty, but it floated in every room. Grover called us one Friday afternoon in late winter and said the opposing side was willing to talk seriously. I remember sitting down before I fully processed what he said. The final settlement was negotiated over the following months and finalized roughly 9 months after we had hired Odalys. The second LLC restructuring was voided entirely. The forged transfers were ordered returned in full. The earliest transfer remained the most difficult issue because there was still enough ambiguity around my father's capacity that a complete legal victory on that one point would have been uncertain and expensive to pursue. In the end, Renata agreed to repay part of it in a reduced arrangement tied to the overall settlement. The first restructuring, the one Odalys had not been able to declare a forgery, was challenged separately and ultimately unwound on undue influence grounds. Grover presented medical records showing that my father's dementia diagnosis predated it by more than a year. He also emphasized the imbalance of power. She was the spouse controlling the day-to-day environment, the medication routines, the calendar, and the finances while he was declining. The court found that persuasive. When the order came through, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before I could drive home. I had thought I would feel triumphant. I did not. Relief came first, then grief, then a strange kind of rage at how much effort it had taken just to recover what had been my father's by right. The company had spent months in a legal freeze, and even after the ownership was restored, there were consequences everywhere. Several records had to be reconstructed. Some insurance coverage had lapsed. A few vendors had been overpaid or underpaid. One of the properties had gone too long without critical maintenance because the money had been redirected elsewhere. You could almost trace the theft by the places where care had dried up. The criminal case took longer. Eventually, Renata entered a guilty plea to a reduced forgery charge. The county attorney's office resolved the financial exploitation charges through the restitution already built into the civil settlement. She received probation and a suspended sentence. It was not enough to satisfy me emotionally, but Grover told us plainly that elder abuse cases often end that way when the victim has died and can no longer testify. The law could prove the document was forged. It could not make my father stand up in court and describe how it felt to be betrayed. There are some losses that never receive the kind of punishment they deserve. Still, I think the part that mattered most to me was not the plea itself. It was knowing that she could no longer hide behind the story she had written about herself. She had been forced, at least in part, to answer for what she had done. In the months after the settlement, I started noticing how many ordinary moments had been contaminated by this entire experience. There was a day when I opened the drawer in my office and found the birthday card my father had signed 3 weeks before the forged restructuring. I had almost forgotten I kept it. I read the message again, and my throat tightened for reasons I did not entirely understand. The card was simple. He had written that he loved me, was proud of me, and hoped the school year was going well. The signature at the bottom was faint and shaky, but the 7s were crossed. It was unmistakably him. That card became one of my most treasured possessions, not because it is valuable, but because it is proof that my father remained himself in tiny, stubborn ways even while dementia was taking pieces from him. There was also a Sunday afternoon, about 8 months before his death, that has never quite left me. I had come to visit and found Renata unusually insistent that he needed his rest. She said it politely, but there was tension beneath it. My father had been sitting in the den watching old golf on television, and he looked alert enough when I arrived. Then she interrupted us twice, once with coffee and once with medication, and each time she steered the conversation away from business. At the time, I thought she was being protective. Later, I wondered whether she was controlling the conditions under which he could be witnessed. I do not know for certain that she arranged every awkward visit or every shortened conversation. I know enough not to make claims I cannot prove. But I also know that once someone has proved willing to forge a signature, your memory of every prior interaction starts rearranging itself under the weight of that knowledge. Desmond flew in from Denver twice during the year after the case broke open. The first time was for the deposition. The second time, he said, was because he needed to sit in our father's old office and remember what the company had felt like before it was poisoned. We spent an entire afternoon there sorting files, reviewing property lists, and talking through things our father had once explained to us in passing, but never taught in a formal way. There were metal filing cabinets, a framed photo of him shaking hands with a paper mill supervisor from decades earlier, and another photo from the first property closing. His face younger and still a little uncertain. I realized, looking at those images, that I had spent so many years assuming there would always be time to ask him everything later. Now there was no later. My father had always been proud of building something tangible. He had come from a family where money was scarce and work was manual. He liked things he could hold, measure, and repair. A property deed, a maintenance schedule, a bank statement, a handwritten note. He trusted systems only insofar as they could be checked. That is what makes the whole betrayal feel especially cruel to me. Renata did not just take money. She took advantage of the very habits that made my father a good businessman. He believed in records, he believed in orderly paperwork. He believed that if a thing had been signed, filed, and notarized, it was real. That belief was the thing she used against him. After the case closed, the company had to be rebuilt in practical, unglamorous ways. Marsh Property Group was not in ruins, but it had suffered. Renata had let deferred maintenance stack up at 2 of the properties. One roof needed urgent attention. A parking lot had gone too long without repaving. We discovered an insurance policy on the larger office building had lapsed and only got renewed in time to prevent a much larger problem. There were odd gaps in accounting records that took months to reconcile. Some of that was innocent neglect. Some of it was the kind of damage you only discover after someone stops caring about the thing they are draining. Neither Desmond nor I had the background to run commercial property operations at the level my father had. We were both competent adults, but we were not him. So we hired an experienced operations director, and, for the first time in my life, I learned what it meant to ask questions. I had once assumed only my father needed to answer. What is the occupancy rate? Which tenant is behind on payments? When does this HVAC unit need replacement? How much reserve do we have before the next major repair? I was surprised to find that some part of me enjoyed it. Not the betrayal, never that, but the chance to understand the life my father had built, rather than just inherit the consequences of it. I also started noticing how often other families around me were vulnerable in similar ways. At school, I saw students caring for grandparents. At the grocery store, I heard adult children talking about assisted living, power of attorney, and bank access. It made me realize how much of elder financial abuse depends on invisible trust. No one is suspicious until there is a reason to be. A spouse handles the mail, a caregiver manages the bills, a child lives far away and assumes the home front is stable. Then one day, a single odd signature or an unexplained transfer reveals that the whole arrangement has been built on someone else's access. Odalis told me something near the end of the process that stayed with me. She said forgers rarely succeed against a person who knows the original signer well. Family members pick up on the private habits, the unconscious motions, the tiny deviations from muscle memory. Her report proved the forgery, but my eye caught the thing first. She said that without my noticing the crossed sevens, the case might still have been uncovered eventually, but it would have been harder, slower, and possibly never as strong. I did not feel heroic hearing that. I felt sad that a single habit my father developed in 1974 ended up being the thing that helped expose what had happened to him. Marcus Okonkwo, the probate attorney who first mentioned the restructuring, told me later that he thinks about our case often. He said he has changed how he reviews caregiver spouse transfers ever since. He flags more things now. He asks more questions. He no longer treats a pre-death restructuring as routine just because it has legal language and notarization attached. He told me that most attorneys do not see this kind of fraud often enough to imagine it in advance, and that the people who survive it usually survive because someone notices one strange detail and refuses to dismiss it. That sounded almost too simple, but it is true. If Marcus had not mentioned the ownership changes, I might never have looked. If I had looked but not kept the old cards, I might have lacked enough examples to confirm my suspicion. If Odalis had not been as precise as she was, Renata might have argued the documents were merely the work of age and illness. If Grover had not known how to build a case around both forgery and undue influence, the whole thing might have collapsed into a messy family dispute instead of a provable fraud. People like to imagine justice is a single moment. It is not. It is a chain of small acts. A bank teller noticing a mismatch, a daughter comparing signatures, an expert explaining stroke patterns, a lawyer filing the right motion, a prosecutor choosing to keep pushing. Each step matters only if the one before it happened. I still think about Renata sometimes, though less often than I used to. I know she sold the house they shared about 6 months after the settlement and moved out of state. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it once and then regretted doing so. I have not looked into her life since. I do not know whether she remarried or found someone else to attach herself to, or whether she ever tells herself a story in which she was misunderstood. That part is no longer mine to carry. What is mine is my father's chair. It sits in the corner of my home office now, a heavy leather desk chair he had reupholstered twice rather than replace. I did not take it because I needed furniture. I took it because it felt like the right thing to keep. Some evenings, after grading papers or going through property reports, I sit in it and let the room be quiet. I think about the man who built a company from paper mill wages and discipline. I think about the fact that illness made him vulnerable, but did not erase who he was. I think about the narrow line between trust and exploitation, between care and control. I keep the birthday card in the same drawer as Odalus's final report and the settlement papers. It is strange, I know, to keep a memory of affection beside proof of fraud. But that is what this story is made of. Love and evidence, grief and paperwork. A father's crossed sevens and a forged version that forgot them. Some nights I still picture the bank teller sliding that card across the counter. She had looked so apologetic, as if the document itself had committed a social offense. I wonder whether she realized she had just handed me the first thread in a larger unraveling. Probably not. Most important things begin that way, quietly and without ceremony. The company now belongs to Desmond and me, evenly split according to my father's genuine will. We have spent the time since the settlement learning the business he spent his life building. It is not glamorous work. It involves tenants, maintenance schedules, leases, vendor contracts, and all the ordinary discipline that keeps a place functioning. But every time I sign a document now, I notice my own hand. I make sure I know what I am agreeing to. I keep copies. I read the fine print. My father would have appreciated that. He was not a suspicious man by nature, but he believed in accountability. He believed that a thing should be exactly what it claims to be. That is why the wrong sevens mattered so much. They were not just a handwriting quirk. They were evidence that the thing claiming to be him was not him at all. I do not know whether there is a clean moral to this story. If there is one, it is that betrayal often arrives wearing the face of care, and that the smallest details are sometimes the only honest ones left. My father's life was not defined by the woman who forged his signature. It was defined by the work he did, the family he built, and the stubborn habits that remained intact even when his memory did not. The forgery did not erase him. It only proved how hard someone had to work to try. And in the end, that is what saved us. Not money, not luck, but the fact that my father's real handwriting still remembered itself, even when someone else tried to imitate it.